Good morning, Year 9 Photography. So this is the continuation of the cover work whilst I'm away on my course. And today we're going to be looking at layers, movement and opacity. And that's really about overlapping to create a sense of movement. And that comes off the back of us studying particularly the work of Victor Song and Bill Wadman with Dancers in Motion and the techniques, the photographic technique of shutter drag. So I also want to introduce this photographer today. She's actually a student photographer in Chicago. So she's not that much older than you, but she's become very well known because of this project, which I think is a fascinating project. She encountered people, she asked her friends, people she met in the street to just talk with her while she took some photographs of them. And she talked to them about really ordinary things like how's the weather and so on. And then suddenly she would say to all of them, "You look really beautiful today." And in that moment, she would make a second image. So she would have made an image while she was just talking to them about any old thing. And then she would make another image where she said this most lovely thing to them. And the reactions she got from all these different people were really fascinating. So sometimes the reactions are about a feeling of happiness. We can see on the face of the girl in this paired image that she's thinking about being called very beautiful, and it brought a smile to her face. There are other examples of these paired images where people look really, really shocked, and some of those photographs are quite poignant. It's actually quite sad that perhaps we don't spend the time to stop and say to each other that you look really nice today, or there's something about you that makes me happy, or something that maybe affirms or confirms to somebody else um, that you think highly of them. Anyway, her name is Shia Glover, and it says there she's made a series of images in which she photographs people's reaction to being told they're beautiful. Now, the reason why she's quite useful for us is actually you're going to be experimenting with overlapping images of the same person. And so we're going to do that, or I'm going to show you an example of that in Shia Glover's work. And that also links to what you've been doing with me in class with shutter drag, and it also links back to what you've been doing digitally with Mrs. Perry in Monday's lesson. So I've said here, there are many ways we could show a sense of reaction, even just within one image. What visual techniques could we use to achieve a similar result? Now, there are loads of artists who have this kind of technique of overlapping. We can find it in fine art, drawing and painting, and we also find it photographically as well. The outcome you could see on the screen now was really me just playing around with opacity on PowerPoint. So I've not used anything fancy for this. Um, it really is about changing the level of transparency. Uh, Again, I'm going to use that word opacity. Something that is opaque is something that you can't see through. So varying levels of opacity um, really is describing how see-throughable an image is or something is. So I've said by now you will have worked with Mrs. Perry to create digital overlaps, and those are using the portraits you made with me on Wednesday last week, where you took a minimum of 6 images of a friend in class with their head at different positions. We've now digitally overlapped them, experimenting with opacity to create a sense of movement. So it's quite a dynamic sense within a photograph when you've got a single image that's actually made up in many ways of many images. We've experimented with this also just with things like twisting and other forms of drag with long shutter speeds, for example. But today, your task is to make overlap collages of portrait photographs in a much more manual sense, so not digital today, building a sense of movement in 3 or more overlapping images. So what I've done is I have taken portraits shot from different angles and I've printed them on tracing paper. Now, you will realise that tracing paper, its very nature is that you can see through it at least a little. And as such, you can layer the tracing paper so that you can see multiple images within those layers. You're going to stick the experiments into your book, but a top tip for me is actually in your book, if you want to get a really strong sense of lots of different images in one, that rather than just sticking the tracing paper images one on top of the other onto a page, that you actually cut a window out in your book and stick the tracing paper into the book in the window space, so that you can actually hold it up to the light, and the light shining through the layers of tracing paper once they're all compressed and put together will give you a much stronger sense of that overlap. I'm also saying you must annotate your work, making a link between the work of Victor Song, Bill Wadman, and your digital outcomes from Monday's lesson that you did with Mrs. Perry. It's always so important to make sure that your book is up to date, and also in your annotations, you're using that key language. So again, we're talking about shutter drag, even though today we're working in a manual collage style. Even the word collage is very useful to you. The word opaque, opacity, transparent, translucent, layer. Again, back to things like blur, movement, and for those of you writing about what you've done with your cameras, for example, you're writing about shutter speed, especially shutter speed, and you'll know that our shutter speeds have been quite slow recently, haven't they? So that we've been able to get that drag, to get that movement within our frames. So these are the images you're going to be working with. As I said, I've printed it on tracing paper. You're going to cut them up and you're going to layer them. Now, I've done a digital version just to show you here. And again, I've not used Photoshop even, I've just used PowerPoint. You're going to experiment with overlapping the semi-transparent portraits. You could try several versions and try positioning the individual images at different angles too. So it's not just a case of having images exactly on top of one another. You could experiment with fanning them out. You could experiment with turning them upside down. It really doesn't matter. But I do want to see a few different outcomes, please, in your book. And as I mentioned already, top tip for me is rather than sticking them straight onto the page, actually cut a window out in your book and stick your images into the window space so that we can hold it up to the light, and we'll get a much better view with the light shining through of all those layers of images put together. In this one, I've actually used only 3 images at once. If you layer up too much tracing paper at once, you're not actually going to see anything. So don't layer up 6 or 7 together, because then we won't have enough light coming through the tracing paper to be able to see what you've actually got. And then, as your extension, you're also going to produce an analysis page on Victor Song. I made a mistake there. I should have put a capital S. Please don't forget that when you're annotating. But annotating to make links between your work, his work, and also Bill Wadman's photographs, because there is a link between this stuff and what Bill Wadman has done with his Dancers in Motion series. I'm going to give you this sheet as a printout as well. So you're going to use this as a resource sheet. You're going to cut out the images and stick them into your book. I really, really do want you to write about shutter drag to show that you understand how the photographs are made, and by referencing your own photographs that you all by now have. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you're going to do. Just a quick recap, you're going to experiment with overlapping semi-transparent portraits that you will have as resource sheets printed on tracing paper. You should try several different versions, positioning the individual images at different angles too. And then make sure you've got that analysis page on Victor Song, making a connection between what you have done with your shutter drag experiments, with your digital experiments with Mrs. Perry on Monday, and of course a link to Bill Wadman. Use that key language: shutter drag, blur, shutter speed, layer, collage, opacity. All these things are of real importance to you. They're going to earn you marks for your GCSE. I look forward to seeing what you do when I come back to school later this week. And hopefully by that point, you'll have lots and lots of new work in your sketchbooks for me to mark. Anyway, good luck, Year 9 photographers.